Yesterday I was drawn into a fascinating rabbit hole by the most ordinary of circumstances, a critical YouTube comment. You see, when I was going through my YouTube channel, looking at my comments as I usually do, I found one comparing the quality of my script to AI generated content. Now usually I don't bother reacting to these comments, but the fact that this particular guy was verified and so didn't meet the profile of your average troll piqued my curiosity. Maybe it was this discovery or the fact that I was on the toilet and had nothing else to do, but something inside me compelled a response. And I was shocked at what happened next. Usually responding to hate goes nowhere, but this response didn't lead to a further onslaught of insults, but an argument that sparked a philosophically interesting conversation about the nature of artistic expression. You see, his main issue with my video was that my analysis lacked objectivity and dripped with bias. Not only did the core of my argument refuse to acknowledge the many objective problems that the game I was covering suffered from, but this represented such a denial of reality that my content came across as though it had not been created by a human being capable of critical thought. This might seem at first to be nothing special, a drop in the ocean of hate, but when I read through his critique, I realized that underneath the vitriol was a passionate philosophical defense of objective standards in art. Objectivity in the context of artistic expression is the idea that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, but can instead be neatly quantified according to universal standards. And the comment reflected a continuation of this age-old philosophical debate in YouTube form. So I, naturally drawn by the opportunity to debate art philosophy, decided to actually tackle the critique with a degree of intellectual honesty. You see, my problem with it stemmed from the very notion of objectivity in the realm of artistic expression. Our perception of reality is a lot more driven by our personal circumstances and emotions than those who want to fit everything into neat categories account for. Of course, biology plays a role, so in the same way that there's a range of emotions we can feel, there is also a range of aesthetics we can tolerate. But our biology is fundamentally intertwined with so many distinct environmental factors that it's nigh impossible to find a universal consensus on what works and what doesn't, just based on our biology, which ultimately would be the standard one has to meet to prove objectivity. You might be wondering, you're getting kind of abstract here, what do you actually mean? Well, I can easily demonstrate what I mean by deconstructing some of the commentator's specific issues with my critique. The main issue he had with my review was that I neglected the fact that the lack of replayability in the game and poor boss design objectively brought down the quality of the title. But I would dispute that there was anything objective about these arguments. Arguing that the game is less good because it lacks replay value necessarily places a high premium on replayability, which is a subjective bias. Some players might value a linear experience that creates a distinct first impression and consequently has less replay value, whereas others might prefer a more open-ended game full of replay value. And there is no way of objectively proving that either perspective is invalid. The same would apply to boss design, or I could even go further in this debate to 3D versus 2D, or perhaps in the future 4D. Now at this point, as I'm sure you're thinking, I assume the debate was over. How could he possibly disprove the subjectivity of art? And of course, I was right. But there's a reason the video doesn't end here. The third response I received was interesting. Instead of reiterating the same point, he tried to direct my very logic against me. Surely if objectivity doesn't exist, then the very premise of my channel doesn't either. Why produce content made for others that judges quality and pushes for certain norms in game design if there is no such thing as objective standards? Doesn't the very willingness of people to listen to my channel disprove my theory? To be honest, when I heard this, I was a bit flawed. I knew objectivity could not be proved, but I also had a nagging feeling that by flipping my logic on me, he had hit something on the nail. So I sat down and reflected for a bit. And after a period of intense recalibration, a revelation eventually sprung into my head. I realized that his argument was so powerful on a fundamentally human instinct. An instinct that powers conversations about subjectivity and objectivity. Our need for meaning. You see, his new argument rested on a single assumption. That for debates around quality to have meaning, they must be centered around an objective common ground. Otherwise, the conversation lacks purpose, and without purpose is essentially pointless. Now, the assumption that for our choices and preferences to have heft, they must draw off on objective meaning gets to the core of our nature. In many ways, our search for meaning defines us as human beings. We have an intrinsic need to feel as though our actions have a purpose beyond ourselves, to be convinced of their importance. This is why religion has such a broad appeal, and why the idea of subjective morality just seems flaky and even somewhat dangerous. Throughout history, many have thought that if we don't have a grounding in some sort of consensus, order would break down as everyone pursues their mutually incompatible version of the good life in conflict with one another. Now obviously the stakes involved among gamers or painters or involved in any other form of artistic medium aren't existential, although the internet would say otherwise. But the logic used by the religious against the atheistic mirrors the logic used by believers in objective artistic quality versus advocates of subjectivity. You see, much like the religious man, the believer in objective laws of game design clings to the idea that for standards to exist, so must rules. But I believe that the reason why many fall in objective language to establish some sort of universal meaning in many ways goes deeper than our innate need to find personal fulfillment. It gives our arguments power. Now I'm not out here to suggest that angry gamers are somehow power-hungry maniacs, but they do want their voice to have some extra weight to it over others. In their view, how else can standards be maintained? And in doing so, their subconscious calls on them to draw from a source that no one can dispute, a kind of higher authority that determines what is good and what is Ubisoft. This is why I hear objective language most commonly utilized by those who are against the AAA developer zeitgeist, because they are most desperate to find a way to fight back against the powerful economic incentives of the industry. Incentives that cannot be fought if quality is but a subjective and amorphous concept that can be defined by anyone. And don't get it twisted, I am also against loot boxes, against excessive in-game monetization, against exclusivity, and against unreasonable price hikes. So you might ask, if I have a problem with this agenda, does it matter whether subjectivity or objectivity is right if the ends justify the means? And I'd agree if the people were self-aware about their own biases and able to distinguish between rhetorically useful objective language designed to give power to their voice and the subjective reality art exists in. But I can see how you could refute even this argument. In many ways, one could make the claim that you need this illusion of objectivity to establish common ground and enforce standards. It's better if people don't really know what they're talking about. It's better if they're ignorant. But I believe it's possible to understand the subjective nature of your preferences and also form communities and push for standards in gaming. As long as you recognize one key aspect of subjectivity, it isn't a free-for-all. People brought up in similar cultures with similar personalities and similar gaming experiences growing up naturally form fairly similar ideas about quality that almost become enshrined as permanent in their mind. In the same sense that even in highly irreligious societies, morality defends the divide very cleanly among generations and cultural and class lines. Just think of your parents. Do they have fairly consistent and largely unshakable views about the world that they share with many others similar to them? I imagine yes. In Britain, we call that the Brexit vote. And this is why we can still form communities and have power in numbers without objectivity. We just need to accept that sharing a similar subjective reality with similar standards and norms and boundaries with one another is enough. And while rhetorically objective language is still necessary, we can be brought together by understanding the subjective nature of our preferences. Gamers don't get together to critique Bethesda's game design or lack thereof, EA's continued sleaziness, because they have a superior understanding of objectivity. They get together because they are similar people, from similar backgrounds, and thus have similar preferences. And as to the question of debating, all we need to debate what works and what doesn't is agreement on certain fundamentals. For example, if I'm arguing with another guy and we both claim that naturalistic dialogue is better, but one film's dialogue is objectively more realistic than another's, because we can compare it to real life conversations, you can make a direct one-on-one comparison, I can call the other guy out. I can say that this film is clearly less naturalistic. I can't, however, call out someone who says they like camp dramatic dialogue, who prefers that film versus the other film, because at that point we wouldn't share any common ground. A good example of an excellent debater that doesn't rely on objectivity is Many a True Nerd. In his video, Fallout 3 is better than you think, he doesn't try to draw on objective standards to try and explain why Fallout 3 is unfairly maligned in the gaming discourse. He adopts his opponent's logic and uses it against them, showing how by their own parameters, Fallout 3 is better than they claim. When H-Bomber Guy argues that Fallout 3's prologue is worse than New Vegas because it offers very little choice, Many a True Nerd lists off the myriad choices that players have in Fallout 3 versus New Vegas. He doesn't try and come up with his own logic. Like and subscribe if you liked the video. If you didn't, remember, no refunds on your time.